The desert was not Rommel's ally, it was his undoing. Beneath the legend of the Desert Fox lay a war dictated by fuel shortages, fractured command, and the illusion of mastery. British and German reports alike reveal a campaign driven less by brilliance than by desperation and chance. Let's uncover the 10 facts about the Desert War that history never told in full. 1. The myth of Rommel's unstoppable advance. The legend of Erwin Rommel's desert triumphs often begins with the image of a general who could outthink and outrun any opponent, sweeping through North Africa with unmatched precision and speed. Popular histories and wartime newsreels described him as the Desert Fox, a master of maneuver whose intuition and daring alone drove the Afrika Korps deep into Allied lines. This portrayal, however, conceals a very different reality, one shaped less by genius than by circumstance, exhaustion, and fragile logistics stretched far beyond their limits. When Rommel arrived in Libya in February 1941, his orders were limited: to stabilize Italian defenses and prevent total collapse after British advances from Egypt. Yet within weeks, he launched an offensive that forced British units to retreat hundreds of miles. To Berlin and Rome, it looked like a miracle. In truth, it was an improvisation, driven by opportunism and desperation rather than any long-term strategic design. The advance succeeded largely because the British Western Desert Force was exhausted, undersupplied, and redeploying troops to Greece. Rommel seized the moment, but the cost was hidden. Each kilometer gained extended his supply line by another wound. German and Italian logistics relied on the port of Tripoli, over 1,000 miles from the front, and Benghazi offered only partial relief. Every convoy faced British naval interdiction and Royal Air Force attacks from Malta. Fuel shortages plagued Rommel's operations so severely that tanks were sometimes abandoned simply because there was no petrol to recover them. The famed dash of the Afrika Korps was a gamble, not a sustainable strategy. German field reports reveal that his units often fought on half their authorized rations of ammunition and fuel. Even his most celebrated victories, such as the capture of Tobruk in June 1942, left his formations hollowed and exhausted. By the time Rommel advanced into Egypt, he commanded fewer than half the tanks he had on paper. What appeared as momentum was, in truth, the momentum of collapse delayed. The desert, vast and indifferent, magnified every weakness in supply and maintenance. Recognizing this transforms our view of the campaign. Rommel was not a magician of maneuver, but a tactician constantly fighting against geography, logistics, and time itself. His legend grew as his army dwindled, and the myth of unstoppable advance was born precisely because it was already ending. 2. The hidden reality of the supply crisis. The Desert War was not decided by tactics alone, but by what could or could not be delivered over sand and sea. Most popular accounts portray the Afrika Korps as a mobile, well-equipped force, supported by disciplined logistics from the Reich and its Italian ally. The reality was closer to a continuous emergency. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every spare part was contested before it even reached the front. The Axis relied entirely on the Mediterranean route, with Italian merchant ships departing from Naples or Taranto and facing relentless Allied naval and air attacks. Malta, the British island fortress, served as a dagger pointed at these lifelines. Throughout 1941 and 1942, Allied submarines and aircraft sank or damaged a large proportion of Axis shipping. Even when convoys reached Tripoli or Benghazi, the struggle continued inland. The transport network in Libya was primitive. Roads were poor, trucks were few, and railway infrastructure was non-existent beyond Tripoli. What little reached the ports had to be hauled across hundreds of miles of desert, burning nearly as much fuel as it delivered. Rommel repeatedly begged Berlin for more trucks and fuel tankers, but Germany's Eastern Front absorbed nearly all available resources. Italian units, responsible for most of the logistical burden, lacked vehicles and fuel, forcing them to rely on captured British equipment that often broke down in the heat. Maintenance units cannibalized wrecks for spare parts, and frontline troops sometimes resorted to using captured Allied rations. The Afrika Korps became a machine that consumed itself to survive. By mid-1942, Rommel's forces could sustain only limited offensives. Fuel deliveries dropped below critical levels, and ammunition reserves were dangerously low. German commanders reported tanks immobilized not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. By the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Axis position was desperate. Rommel could deploy fewer than 300 operational tanks against more than 1,000 Allied vehicles, and his men were rationed to 1 bottle of water per day. The vaunted Lightning War had ground to a halt under the weight of its own supply lines. The myth of the Desert Fox conceals this simple, brutal truth. The desert favored no one, and victory belonged to those who could feed their machines longer. 3. The illusion of independent command. The image of Rommel as a master strategist acting freely across North Africa has long dominated historical memory. In films, biographies, and wartime reports, he appears as a lone commander shaping the course of the Desert War by sheer will and intellect. The truth is far less romantic. Rommel was never an independent commander. He operated under constant interference from Berlin, Rome, and the complex hierarchy of Axis command. Officially, his Afrika Korps reported through the Italian chain of command to Comando Supremo, the Italian High Command, and his operations required coordination with the Italian Army and Navy. In practice, Rommel frequently exceeded his authority, launching offensives without approval and creating deep friction with Italian leaders. His superiors in Rome viewed him as reckless and insubordinate, while Berlin alternated between admiration and frustration. The result was a fractured command structure that undermined the very operations it sought to direct. Orders were delayed, intelligence miscommunicated, and supply priorities confused. Rommel's own correspondence reveals a commander isolated both politically and geographically. His demands for reinforcements and fuel were often ignored or postponed in favor of the Eastern Front, where Hitler's attention remained fixed. Even within his own army group, coordination with Italian divisions proved challenging. Differences in language, equipment, and doctrine slowed joint operations. When Rommel pushed into Egypt in 1942, he did so against explicit orders to hold his line. His gamble was partly successful in the short term, but it alienated senior commanders and stretched the Axis front beyond repair. As British forces regrouped under Montgomery, the lack of unified strategy among the Axis powers became fatal. The illusion of independent command, a cornerstone of Rommel's legend, was, in reality, the symptom of a dysfunctional alliance. He fought as a field commander surrounded by political constraints, limited supplies, and clashing authorities. His operational brilliance was not the product of total freedom, but of necessity born in isolation. Understanding this reveals how the Desert War was as much a story of divided command as of battlefield maneuver. 4. The misunderstood role of intelligence and deception. Most accounts of the North African campaign emphasize maneuver and tank battles, rarely acknowledging the invisible war of intelligence that shaped every outcome. The British advantage in signals intelligence, logistics forecasting, and deception operations fundamentally altered the balance of power in the desert. At the heart of this was Ultra, the code-breaking program at Bletchley Park that intercepted and deciphered German communications. From 1941 onward, British commanders often knew Axis supply movements, troop strengths, and operational intentions before they unfolded. Rommel never realized the full extent of this penetration. He suspected leaks within his staff, but attributed most Allied successes to luck or reconnaissance. British use of this intelligence was cautious. To protect the source, they often disguised it as information gathered from aerial reconnaissance. As a result, Allied countermoves appeared almost prophetic, reinforcing the myth of Rommel's overextension rather than exposing his vulnerability to cryptologic warfare. The desert was also a battlefield of deception. British forces perfected camouflage, dummy tanks, and false radio networks to mislead Axis intelligence. During the preparations for El Alamein, entire divisions were simulated in sectors where no troops existed, while real formations shifted silently under cover of darkness. These methods confused Axis command assessments and led Rommel to deploy reserves to the wrong areas. Meanwhile, Axis intelligence lacked comparable resources and coordination. Italian reconnaissance aircraft were limited in range, and German intelligence staff suffered from language barriers and outdated methods. The failure to anticipate British operations stemmed not from incompetence, but from systemic disadvantage. Logistics, intelligence, and deception worked together to strangle the Afrika Korps. Every successful British convoy or hidden maneuver translated into fewer supplies and more isolation for Rommel's forces. This hidden dimension of the war reveals that tactical skill could not compensate for strategic blindness. The Desert Fox fought a visible war of movement, but his enemies fought an invisible one of information. And won. 5. The decline of the legend. By the end of 1942, the Desert War had shifted irreversibly against the Axis. Yet Rommel's image in the German and Allied press remained that of a noble, chivalrous commander fighting impossible odds. The origins of this myth lay in wartime propaganda. For Germany, Rommel's victories offered proof that the Wehrmacht could succeed even when outnumbered. For Britain and the United States, portraying him as an honorable adversary served another purpose. It elevated Allied victories by implying they had overcome the best the enemy could offer. Newspapers and newsreels on both sides contributed to building a heroic image that outlived the campaign itself. In reality, by late 1942, Rommel was physically ill, emotionally exhausted, and trapped between Hitler's orders and the collapse of his army. His letters to his wife revealed deep frustration with the lack of supplies and his disillusionment with Nazi leadership. As the British Eighth Army advanced after El Alamein, Rommel withdrew in good order, but knew the war in Africa was lost. The German High Command continued to issue impossible orders to hold positions that no longer existed. The Afrika Korps became a shadow of its former self, reduced to isolated pockets of resistance in Tunisia by early 1943. Yet even in defeat, the legend grew. After the war, Allied historians and filmmakers, seeking to distinguish the professional soldier from the Nazi hierarchy, continued to portray Rommel as an apolitical commander. This narrative, while humanizing, distorted the broader truth. The Desert War was not defined by one man's genius or morality, but by the grinding mechanics of supply, geography, and attrition. The legend of Rommel endures because it offers simplicity in place of complexity, a story of brilliance amid chaos. But the record tells another tale, one of a commander trapped in a collapsing alliance, fighting a war his nation could not supply and his ideology could not sustain. Recognizing this does not diminish his skill. It restores the episode, reality of the campaign itself, a struggle of endurance, not mythology, fought and lost beneath the relentless sun of the North African desert. 6. The myth of Axis, unity in the desert. One of the most enduring misconceptions about the Desert War is the idea that Germany and Italy fought as a cohesive, well-coordinated force under unified command. In countless wartime films and post-war accounts, the Afrika Korps appears seamlessly integrated with Italian divisions, their cooperation guided by shared strategy and mutual respect. The truth, however, was marked by deep mistrust, conflicting doctrines, and constant friction that weakened Axis operations from the start. When Rommel arrived in North Africa, the Italian army had already suffered catastrophic defeats. His assignment to support them was politically sensitive. Hitler had promised Mussolini assistance, not dominance. The official command structure placed Rommel's forces under Italian authority, yet he often acted independently, disregarding Italian orders and launching offensives without consultation. This defiance created resentment among senior Italian officers, particularly Generals Bastico and Graziani, who viewed Rommel as both arrogant and dangerously impulsive. German troops were better equipped, better trained, and enjoyed higher prestige. Italians were underfed, poorly supplied, and frequently used in defensive roles. The disparity deepened morale problems on both sides. Logistically, coordination was disastrous. Italian supply services were overburdened, their convoys slow and vulnerable. German demands for fuel, ammunition, and spare parts often exceeded what the Italians could deliver. Even tactical cooperation on the battlefield suffered from incompatible communication systems and divergent command philosophies. Italian tanks, mostly outdated M13s and M14s, could not keep pace with the faster German panzers, forcing Rommel to deploy them separately. When the Axis launched offensives, such as Operation Crusader in late 1941, these structural weaknesses became fatal. Miscommunication between German and Italian staffs led to units being isolated and overrun. At Tobruk, Italian infantry bore the brunt of losses, while German armor withdrew to regroup. Italian soldiers fought bravely, but were undermined by inadequate support and leadership that prioritized German objectives. This dysfunction was not the product of incompetence alone. It was the inevitable outcome of an alliance built on political convenience rather than operational harmony. Reports from Axis headquarters reveal persistent arguments over priorities. Rome sought symbolic victories, Berlin sought strategic advantage, and both underestimated the logistical impossibility of sustaining their ambitions. The myth of Axis unity conceals how divided leadership crippled their campaign before the enemy ever did. The desert was a proving ground not only for machines and men, but for alliances. And in that test, the Axis command system fractured under its own contradictions. 7. The overestimated role of Rommel's tactics at El Alamein. The Second Battle of El Alamein has long been portrayed as the moment when Rommel's genius met its match. In popular imagination, he was defeated not by material disadvantage, but by the superior planning of Montgomery. The comparison endures as one of tactical opposites, Rommel's intuition versus Montgomery's method. Yet archival analyses reveal a different truth. Rommel's tactics were no longer decisive because his army could not execute them. By the autumn of 1942, the Afrika Korps was running on empty. Supply from Europe had been strangled by Allied naval power, with only a fraction of fuel and ammunition reaching the front. Rommel's operational concept relied on mobility, but by October, his panzers were immobilized by shortages. His defensive line at El Alamein stretched across inhospitable terrain, fortified with mines and field guns, yet lacking reserves to maneuver. Meanwhile, Montgomery's 8th Army, carefully rebuilt after months of preparation, enjoyed overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority. 195,000 men against 116,000, 1,000 tanks against 500, and air dominance that rendered Axis movement nearly impossible by day. Rommel himself was in Germany on medical leave when Montgomery launched the assault on 23rd of October 1942. Command initially fell to General Stumme, who died of a heart attack during the opening phase. When Rommel returned, he faced an unwinnable situation. His counterattacks were not the product of strategic error, but of necessity. The Afrika Korps fought with diminishing ammunition and almost no fuel. Reports indicate that some armored units had fewer than 15 operational tanks left by the end of the battle. German accounts emphasize that they fought to exhaustion rather than defeat by encirclement. El Alamein was not a tactical collapse, it was a logistical one. Rommel's tactics had been reduced to a vocabulary his army could no longer speak. The battle's outcome marked the turning point not because Montgomery outthought Rommel, but because the material balance had shifted irreversibly. The myth of tactical genius and failure obscures a simpler truth. Even the best battlefield maneuvers collapse when supply cannot sustain them. In the desert, strategy was measured not in kilometers gained, but in fuel consumed. 8. The misconception of desert war as a clean campaign. For decades, the North African campaign has been remembered as the gentleman's war, a conflict supposedly fought with mutual respect, free of the brutality seen in Europe or the East. Newsreels of captured soldiers sharing cigarettes or accounts of Rommel's adherence to the laws of war helped build this perception. Yet archival evidence dispels this idealized vision. The Desert War, though distant from civilian populations, was no less harsh or dehumanizing. The conditions alone were merciless. Temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and men often died not from bullets but from thirst, exposure, and exhaustion. Medical supplies were chronically short, and wounded soldiers could languish for days before evacuation. For prisoners, the ordeal was equally grim. While Rommel generally upheld Geneva Conventions, his subordinates and their Italian counterparts often struggled to maintain humane conditions due to logistical collapse. Captured British and Commonwealth troops were sometimes transported in open trucks without water, while Axis prisoners suffered under equally dire circumstances in Allied custody. The desert offered no mercy to any side. Propaganda on both fronts carefully sanitized these realities. German media highlighted Rommel's supposed chivalry, contrasting it with depictions of Eastern Front savagery. Allied reports, eager to present the desert as a clean theater, emphasized professionalism over suffering. The reality was that starvation, disease, and despair were endemic. Dysentery, sandstorms, and mechanical failure claimed more lives than combat in several phases of the campaign. The terrain itself made rescue and recovery difficult. Bodies were often buried where they fell, their graves unmarked, their names forgotten. Moreover, Axis forces relied heavily on local labor and prisoners to maintain logistics, exposing North African civilians to the war's hardships. As the conflict dragged on, both sides resorted to scorched earth tactics, destroying wells, fuel dumps, and depots. The image of a gentleman's war collapses under such evidence. The desert did not distinguish between noble and cruel. It simply consumed everything placed within it. Remembering this dismantles a comforting myth and restores the human cost to a campaign too often viewed as abstract maneuver. 9. The underestimated importance of Allied engineering and logistics. In popular retellings, Allied victory in North Africa is credited to superior leadership and numerical advantage. What is rarely acknowledged is the scale of engineering and logistical effort that made victory possible. Behind Montgomery's 8th Army stood an army of builders, mechanics, and supply officers whose work turned the desert into a functional battlefield. Between August and October 1942, British engineers constructed over 1,000 miles of supply roads and pipelines to sustain the coming offensive. Fuel, water, and ammunition were transported in quantities unimaginable to the Axis. While Rommel's men rationed fuel to the last gallon, British convoys could deliver thousands of tons daily through newly organized depots in Egypt. The Long-Range Desert Group and the Royal Engineers perfected desert navigation, enabling rapid repair of vehicles and roads. Maintenance became a form of warfare. Machines were serviced as meticulously as weapons. Allied air transport, coordinated through the Desert Air Force, further revolutionized mobility, allowing rapid medical, evacuation, and supply drops. In contrast, the Axis struggled with outdated vehicles unsuited for desert conditions, lacking filters and spare parts. German and Italian units cannibalized wrecks for repairs, while Allied workshops could restore entire tanks within hours. Logistics also dictated tempo. Montgomery refused to attack until his supply network could guarantee sustained pressure. His patience contrasted sharply with Rommel's earlier impulsive offensives. By the time of El Alamein, the Allied supply chain was operating with industrial precision. Railheads extended to the front. Pipelines carried fuel directly to armored divisions. Rations and water reached troops with clockwork regularity. This invisible infrastructure transformed the campaign. The Desert War's outcome was not simply a duel of commanders, it was a contest of systems. The Allies mastered the mechanics of supply, while the Axis could never overcome its deficiencies. Acknowledging this gives credit to the soldiers who built and maintained the lifelines of victory, reminding us that wars are won as much by logistics as by valor. 10. The forgotten consequences of defeat in Africa. The fall of North Africa, in May 1943, is often remembered as the end of a secondary front, a necessary prelude to Sicily and Italy. Yet its consequences were profound, reshaping Axis strategy and revealing the fragility of the Nazi alliance system. When the last German and Italian forces surrendered in Tunisia, nearly 250,000 men were taken prisoner, a loss comparable to Stalingrad in scale. The defeat shattered the myth of Axis invincibility and exposed the limitations of its logistics and industry. It also marked the first time German forces faced complete destruction in a Western theater. In Berlin, the propaganda ministry struggled to explain the disaster. Goebbels ordered strict censorship, describing the loss as a strategic withdrawal. In Italy, the collapse deepened public disillusionment with Mussolini's leadership. The North African campaign had drained Italy of manpower and resources, and its army's repeated failures destroyed the illusion of parity with Germany. Within months, Mussolini's regime began to unravel, culminating in his removal from power in July 1943. For the Allies, victory in Africa provided not only a morale boost, but a strategic springboard. It secured the Mediterranean, opened the route to southern Europe, and demonstrated that coordinated coalition warfare could succeed. Yet for many who fought there, the legacy was less triumphant. Thousands of graves remained unmarked in the desert, their occupants anonymous beneath drifting sand. The harsh lessons of supply, coordination, and endurance learned in North Africa would shape every subsequent Allied operation. The myth of the Desert Fox endured, but the reality of the campaign revealed something larger: the limits of will when measured against logistics, geography, and coalition strength. North Africa was not merely a sideshow, it was the proving ground of modern warfare, where the mechanical age met the human cost of endurance. The desert silenced legends and exposed truths that command and courage alone could not overcome. History rarely tells everything, but what it leaves behind still defines us. The Desert War was not a tale of heroes and villains, but of endurance measured against distance, supply, and time. Each forgotten detail restores the humanity within the machinery of war. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and keep history alive.